All right, sweet.
Good. Let's start.
Awesome. Ashley Holland, thank you so much for doing this one.
No problem.
I wanted to start this, and I imagine this might be even a bit embarrassing for you to hear, but there's only one way I want to start this, and it's a quote. It's on your website. I'm going to read out to your testimonial page. Ashley is the single most capable guide I've encountered in my 25-year wildlife filmmaking career. We spent 3 months in the bush together on a shoot in a seriously remote area. Everything was superbly organised and went as planned. His team was excellent and everyone remained cheerful at all times. Great memories. Can't wait to return to Guyana and do it all again.
Who was that?
That was Colin Stafford Johnson.
Well, he's famous for embellishing stuff. So,
Is he?
Yeah. I wouldn't read too much into that.
Well, I didn't even read that until when you were doing this one. So that wasn't the reason why you're here or I wanted to interview. But it was interesting because you kept on asking me a few times, understandably, what kind of questions I'm going to ask you. And I think most of them are kind of summed up in a few kind of hits here about just the bush and guide and organize and how you do that, right? I was also looking through your website, doing my research, and I noticed a few like Jeremy Wade, the River Monsters dude. So I was just, that was, I reckon, one of the best TV shows ever made. And
It was a very popular show for sure.
Oh, so good. And I realized, like, even though I'm Aussie, I'm actually probably a bit young. I think I missed him by a few years, Steve Irwin. But I remember growing up to Steve Backshall on Deadly 60. And he also had a quote, I think the end one was, I trust Ash with my life and know that anyone who travels with him will have the experience of a lifetime. Pretty cool
All
stuff.
These guys embellish way too much.
They're all salesmen.
You know how much I paid them to write that?
But it's a great place to start because I think like one thing probably the thing I'm most interested in, and the reason I've even started this podcast and interviewing people and talking to them, is that myself, growing up in a city, suburbs, everyone I know, grew up and currently lives in, what you call modern civilization, usually a city. Yet humans for basically all of history and still in a place like this are living, what is it, subsistence farming or subsistence farming in the wilderness, village life. That's far more natural. Yet there's a few people who are trying to, thank you, to form like a bridge between the two. That's kind of what I'm trying to do in my life. And you and many others in their own unique ways seem to have that going. So that's kind of what we'll probably try to hit.
I think for me that just came naturally. I mean, I know I was watching TV the other day on we have Sky TV here now.
Nice.
We've upgraded for years. We didn't have anything for years and years and years. The last couple of years, we've managed to get Sky TV and internet, and we've joined the modern world.
Perfect.
But I was watching TV the other day, and there's a program called Off the Grid or something like that, Below the Line, something like that. But it's with families, and this was based in the States, where traditional families from urban areas, have decided that they've had enough of the modern world and they want to move back to a more simplistic lifestyle. And invariably they go up to Alaska or some remote place and they make a cabin and they live off the land, and sort of it's a learning process. The show is about them learning and their challenges of moving back to a simpler way of life and a more traditional way of life, I suppose. For me, I didn't really make that decision, well, I want to escape the city. I grew up in wild places my whole life, from very early age. And so for me, this was natural. This was home, and I think my passion for wildlife and wild places partly comes from my mother, who was very adventurous, who spent many years in South America and in Africa, and then partly just from exposure from growing up in this. And so for a short period of time that I did live in England as a young teenager. I wasn't particularly happy.
Sure.
And so when in my later teens, in my early 20s, and I had the opportunity to just move here, I ended up just sort of living here and just sort of went from there. Yeah.
So it's
an organic process then, it basically is what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting to see because, I mean, for context, me and my two friends, Ted and Zav, couldn't get more like city suburban childhoods and whatnot. Yet, especially Ted and I have always been drawn to this kind of adventurous thing and the last few years for me especially have been like a rewilding process, and this region of the world centered on Mount Roraima for whatever reason was like a beacon of that's like the middle of the world, like the middle of nowhere. That's the lost world kind of thing. And then to end up in Yupukari, mistaking it for, what is it, Karopakari?
Kopakari.
Kopakari on a hitchhike. And immediately oh shit, we're 3 hours off the highway here in the Guyanese savannah, but greeted very friendly straight into a wedding, which I believe is your brother-in-law, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Which was again, unique experience. And then I think it was, is it your daughter who quite clearly kind of looks like
Sasha,
looks
She looks more European than Amerindian.
Exactly. We're like, and then I think you were on the motorbike for a second, like, hang on, who are these people? What's the story here?
Right.
But it's interesting that you say it's an organic thing. It was never someone I don't know if the term's politically correct or not, but like going native. It wasn't really that situation.
No, it wasn't. It was organic.
Did you want a juice, by the way?
No, I'm okay actually for attending. So I mean, I came to Guyana. I mean, my early childhood, as I mentioned to you before, my mom was an extraordinary character in her own right.
What was she?
So she was English. Both my parents were English. My mom was passionate about wildlife. She left school at a very early age. Born in Essex, in England. Left school at an early age. 15, 16, as many children did in those days, and started working on a farm because she loved the outdoors. And then from being a farmhand, somewhere along the line, she ended up working in a zoo.
Okay.
And in the UK as a zookeeper, trainee zookeeper. And I guess she worked her way up. And in those days, when zoos wanted, of course, these days it's heavily frowned upon. They don't do this anymore. But in those days, when a zoo wanted this, of course, in the 1960s. But in those days, when a zoo wanted a collection, quite often what they would do is they would send somebody out to a place, and they would have a list of the animals that they wanted for their zoo. And basically that person's job would be to procure these animals, and that often would mean buying from local traders, going into villages, because a lot of indigenous people will have wild animals as pets. They will buy animals as pets, or even going out and actually capturing some of these animals. And it would be a long process, as you might imagine.
Shopping list,
yeah, it's like a shopping list for wildlife. Yeah.
Okay, here's the grant.
And so my mom came out, and of course you don't do that in a week or two. It would be sort of a 3-4 months long process to get all these animals, feed them, then of course ship them back to the UK.
Real quick, nowadays, is it just
it's all captive breeding? Yeah, it's captive breeding predominantly. Yeah, and it's just that's the way it was done in those days, right? Sure. And so my mum did this, and that was her first introduction to South America here in Guyana. Okay. And this would have been in the mid-60s, I guess, somewhere around there. And then the following, a few years later, I guess, I'm not sure of the exact specifics, but she was asked to come and do this again, a second tour. Whereupon my mom, as we say in Guyana, she's a bit of a hustler. She was always looking at trying to make a few bob on the side, right?
Okay.
And so she
sets up her own illegal black market.
Yeah, so she advertised in the local newspaper, of course no internet in those days, advertised in the local newspaper that she was off to South America for 4 months, or whatever it was, and any adventurous spirit would like to join, call this number. And so she was effectively selling a tour. And I think much to her amazement probably, and looking back in hindsight, I'm pretty amazed that she got anybody, but she managed to get a few people who were interested in this.
Okay.
And so they paid her a little bit of extra, and they came out, and they had obviously had an adventure of a lifetime, running around the savannas and the rainforests, catching animals.
I mean, it's already still blowing my mind how many animals you see, but it's what, 60 years ago?
I could imagine, yeah, and how wild the place must have been, right? Yeah. Of course, no road from Georgetown to here at that time. And so, I don't think the people actually spent the whole 4 months with her. They probably came for a month each or whatever it was. And so in some ways, she was one of the first people to sort of really do tourism in Guyana. And anyway, she returned back. She's still working for the zoo, and she wrote a book about her adventures in South America. I think it's called Safari South America, or The Magic Saki. It's one book. It has 2 titles depending.
What's the second title?
The Magic Saki.
The Magic Saki.
Yeah. Okay. Saki is a type of monkey we have here. Okay, white-faced Saki monkey. And So she wrote a book about it, and I think that was her introduction to South America and her real passion for real wilderness places. And somewhere along the line, she decided, well, she wanted to do tourism in South America. And in those days, there was no ecotourism in South America. There were no lodges. I don't think even the word ecotourism had been coined as yet.
Wow.
And so she realized that she needed experience. And the only place where she could get that experience was Africa. That was the only place that really had sort of started doing ecotourism as we now know it,
Yeah.
sort of with lodges and doing safaris. And so my mom, who had met my dad was very non-adventurous compared to my dad loved wildlife, but he was very, very mellow in his character. And
It sounds like that kind of woman would have needed someone.
yeah,
Like,
chalk and cheese, right?
she was
Something
always
to
gonna be-
balance. Yeah. She managed to persuade my dad to emigrate to South Africa.
Hmm.
And they waited until I was born, and then when I was 3 months old, we emigrated to South Africa. And my mom became a wildlife guide at the Kruger National Park, which in itself, in those days, you know, there must have been very few female guides. So again, she's a bit of a pioneer in that field.
Cool.
And so she did that for a few years, and then my mom and my dad split up after about a year and a half. I think the cultural shock was too much for my dad, coming from Devonshire in England to the harsh, you know, climate of South Africa, and it's just a different world, isn't it? And so my mom continued working, but because we were now a single parent family, I went and lived with an Afrikaans-speaking family
Okay.
who'd become good friends with my mom.
Was that just because she was
single parent, correct?
literally
She
in
had
the
to
field
work,
so much,
and she was out guiding on safari and doing everything. And so obviously it was a real challenge
not
because I was
exactly a
only
work from home
I was
job.
only 2-3 years old, right?
Sure.
So effectively for the first 8 or 9 years, I actually lived with with an Afrikaans-speaking family. I would see my mom on holidays, and so I lived with this other family. I had a son who was a year older than me, and so even my first language isn't actually English. I grew up speaking Afrikaans. It was only until I got to be about 9 when we moved. My mom moved to Botswana to run a lodge in Botswana in the Okavango, that I went to go and live with her.
Okay.
And that's when I sort of started to learn English and properly and read and write in English a little bit.
Do you still speak Afrikaans?
Ja, ik kan Afrikaans praat. Dat is mijn eerste taal. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. It never. I mean, I've lost words, right?
Sure.
And because of course there's no one here to converse with. But you know, if my sister comes every few years to visit me, she speaks Afrikaans, and when
she was in the same situation.
She was, yeah, but she was older. She was 9 years older than me. So when my dad left, she went to boarding school in South Africa.
Okay.
And so, but when I speak with my sister, yeah, it comes back and we can speak in Afrikaans, yeah. So, and then when we moved to Botswana, it must have been about 8 or 9, which was an amazing place. I mean, I was going out on safari all the time. I didn't go to school. My mom home taught me. And homeschooling there consisted of, you know, she'd fling a book at me every now and then and say, read that, and leave me to it. And I remember maths classes used to consist of adding up the score. Of course, those days, we lived in a grass thatch hut on the edge of the Talamacani River. And Tilly lamps, you know, the old lamps, the kerosene lamps.
Yes.
No electricity or anything. And so in the evenings, no TV or anything like that. There used to be a radio. But we used to play cards. And so my maths lessons used to consist of adding up the scores for the cards, right?
Yep.
And so wonderful schooling in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. I wrote that. Yeah.
So the rest of the day I was out running around fishing and messing around in the bush.
What's the show where the kid is raised by wild animals? Is it Jungle Book?
Jungle Book. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't quite that extreme,
Yeah.
but I certainly had a very free reign with my childhood, a magical childhood actually in many ways.
And were there other kids from other foreigners in the thing,
No.
or was it all local kids?
No, I was purely with local kids.
Yep.
Yeah. There was a German family that was maybe 8 or 9 miles away that we would occasionally go and visit. Yeah.
Because even not to disrupt the flow, but even here, like even if it's organic, there still is a bit of a disconnect just by having that link, that bridge with the outside world and England and whatnot. When you're a kid, even now in this village, like, is that something you feel or conscious of, even though you've lived in it your whole life? Or how does that affect things?
Yeah, so I mean, when we left Africa, I spent a year and a half in England before my mom came to South America to start her own lodge here. But so I had that bit of experience there, and then when we came to Guyana, I was 13, now turning 14.
Okay. Maybe even
Yeah.
before in Africa, when you're playing with African, and this might be taking it you too far back.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
You
Like on
know,
the
I was too
schoolyard.
young to really appreciate something like that or understand anything like
Sure.
that. Yeah. As an adult now, I very much recognize that in many ways, and people have said this, is that I bridge two worlds. I have a foot in each culture, and I can see it from both angles, right? Probably more so from a local angle because I've spent so much of my life here, but I have spent time obviously abroad in England. When I was in my early 20s, I would go and work there for a few months each year.
Yeah.
And obviously culturally, you know, I was brought up.
Exactly. I think that's the big
South
thing,
Africa,
isn't it?
yeah.
Like just your
But
just inner beliefs and perspectives of the world is hard to kind of shake from your parents to a certain degree. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as a child, you're molded, you know, like plasticine, you're molded in a lot of stuff. So yeah. I mean, I certainly do get that. You know, I see things differently from a lot of other people in terms of local culture here.
But again, it's a very powerful position, and that's why I'm so interested in, as you said it, the foot in both camps, the bridge, because basically everyone's in that side now, and everyone's moving or trying to move from most people from like the kind of this village stuff to cities, urbanization, whatever it is. Yeah,
It's funny because you see here a lot of local people here want to move out and they want to go to the bright lights in the cities, especially the younger generation.
exactly.
Right? They grew up with this, and so for them it's all exciting going to the city. I mean, we have a big city called Boa Vista in Brazil, not too far from here. And you know, a lot of youngsters, you know, want to go and work there, and a lot of them do go work there, and many of them don't come back. So one of my brother-in-laws, you know, has been living in Brazil for years and years and years in Boa Vista, and that yet in the West, you know, a lot of people are trying to escape the cities and come out to places. In fact, you know, it's one of the things I tell my guides is that, you know, people coming out here to see the nature and the wilderness that we have in wildlife, we take it kind of for granted. But these are people who are willing to pay money, and with, you know, this is something that they have a passion for and want to see and experience. Right?
Absolutely, and because it's a increasingly two-way street, there's more people from the villages now able to go to the cities, but the people in the cities are kind of getting worse for most people, so they're trying to go back. And even the richest, at least how I've witnessed it, the richest stratas of those city societies are trying to now buy farms on the outskirts of the town and all that stuff. People who organically, like, are both like 2 feet firmly in both camps and a real bridge are sparse and very kind of useful for humanity assets, you being one of them. So that's yeah.
Useful for humanity.
Don't you reckon?
Mate, that's 2025. That's a good start to the year.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if it's useful, but it's you know, it's a unique perspective. Put it like that. Yeah. So I mean, I get a lot of people will ask me.
You're like a mediator, because otherwise it's if you can't communicate. Like the breakdown of communication is always violence. Like that's like the last thing when communications don't work. It's violence. It's wars. That's a big scale. But just conflict of any kind when the communication can't. And the more things, you know, I don't really know how. I'm not very good with words, I guess. But yeah, I think the more those bridges that exist, the more we can have access to both perspectives and put ourselves into someone else's shoes on those extreme sides, the better. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Anyway, so you're in Africa.
Yeah, so we spent a few years in Botswana, and then my mom decided that she was going to come back to South America and do her tourism. She felt
That's right, because she was only there to.
Yeah, she was. Her original plan was to go for 5 years or something, just learn to work and then come back and follow her dream here, sort of thing. But 5 years ended up being sort of 12 years or something like that.
Sure.
And so then we decided to, or she decided to leave and come back and to England. And of course, I didn't have much say in that, being 12 years old, but I was not impressed. But anyway, we came and we moved down to Devon.
Yep.
Down in the southwest.
That's just
Torquay.
Yeah. 3 months ago. Yeah.
And because I was born in Devon.
Nice.
My dad was from Devon. My mom was from Essex. But so we spent about a year and a half in England. And during that time, my mom was coming out here to Guyana. Well, she was interested in doing her lodge either in Guyana or Suriname.
So she would always come to these places.
So she also spent quite a lot of time in Suriname as well.
Okay. But not further south in South America.
No, it was Suriname, French Guyana, and Guyana, the three Guyanas, but predominantly Suriname and Guyana.
And do you know what? Because on a global scale, I mean, obviously not for you, but most people don't know where Guyana is on a map. They've never even heard of it. Like those three, I think, are known as kind of the forgotten countries in South America usually. Why was?
Well, Guyana simply because being an ex-British colony, links to the UK. So for her coming down here would have just made sense, and the language. And I think when she first came, it was still a British colony. So I think just logistically and for practical purposes, it made sense. Suriname, I'm not exactly sure why she spent some time in Suriname. I know she did some reporting for a radio program. They were flooding a huge tract of forest there for a hydroelectric dam. And there was a very large, at the time, I think it was the largest wildlife rescue operation in the world.
Wow. What does that even look like?
Well, basically, it meant teams going out and collecting animals that were being flooded and trapped on islands. As water rose, the animals were being flooded out, less and less land, and so animals were being trapped on tiny little islands and then having to swim miles and miles. And of course, a lot of animals were drowning because it was thousands of square miles, or hundreds of square miles that this dam was flooding. And it was run by an American company, wildlife NGO then. To rescue as many animals as possible.
Wow.
And so my mom went out to report on it. It was a radio program. And so she was reporting every weekend about what they'd rescued and all the adventures that they had there, the team had there. It was a big team. So I think that's how she sort of got into Suriname and spent time in Suriname.
And you might have felt a bit comfortable there with the Dutch. Yeah.
I would have done, yeah. But in the end, when she did decide to come back to do her tourism, at that time Suriname was going through some political problems. And so she opted for Guyana. Guyana had also just had been through some tough political times, but it had things were easing a little bit in Guyana and getting a little bit better. And so because of the language and the fact that Suriname was under a lot of pressure at the time, she opted to return to Guyana.
Okay, cool.
So that made
start
sense.
her lodge.
Start her tourism. And so we did. She started a little camp in the Mazruni River, which is further north of where we are living here, much further north. And so from the age of 13, 14 till about 18, 19.
Was this the Kuparama Lodge?
No, it was called Jacaranda Camping Safari. Okay.
Yeah.
Jacaranda.
Jeez, we have a lot of jacarandas back home.
Yeah.
But I know they're from here.
Right, yeah. So we had a jacaranda tree at the river there. Nice. And hence that's where it was going. It was a little, very simple little lodge. It was a hammock sort of lodge. You slept in hammocks. And it was on an island up the Mazruni River, middle of nowhere, because the river there is huge. It's about 5 miles wide, wow. 6 miles wide, and these islands that are full of forested jungle islands. And so she would lead tours from Georgetown. People come in and do that. Yeah.
Oh my goodness! And it was. How do you even get there? Is it a flight? Or
it was from Georgetown. You'd go overland, then by boat.
Okay.
Yeah. It'd take about 4 or 5 hours from Georgetown to get there. So it wasn't quite as remote as this.
Okay.
As where we are here now, but we're still remote by most people's standards, yeah. So, we were about 40 miles up the river from the nearest town.
So you're literally on a lodge, unlike here, you're on a lodge and the lodge is the only thing there?
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it basically you, your mum, your sister?
Just me, my mum, and the crew that she hired. She had a local partner that helped.
Who would have, I imagine, having shift work though, they wouldn't have been wanting to live there full time.
Yeah, so the workers would come from Bartica, which was a little town 40 miles downstream, and they would probably do, I can't remember now, I'm just getting on a few years ago. Yeah, month on, month off kind of thing, yeah. And they'd have cook and guides and a couple of boat captains.
Oh my God, that's such a wild way of growing up. Mm-hmm. And this is directly
So again, I left there, of course, when, so we spent a year and a half in England, and I was going to school. And when my mom decided now she was coming back to South America, she said to me, well, Ashley, So I'm off to South America, and I'm going to go and do my lodge. And you can decide what you want to do now. You're old enough to decide what you want to do. You can either stay in England with your dad and go to school, or if you like, you can come to Guyana with me. Well, it took me about 7 seconds to make up my mind, and
Sure.
we left school behind, and here I ended up
Brilliant.
in the jungles. And of course, I didn't go to school again. It was back to homeschooling again, which basically consisted of reading more books.
Wow. And in those 7 seconds of deliberation, do you remember much about that year and a half in England? Because I can't even imagine so far with Africa and then South American sites. Like, how would you have been on an English schoolyard?
Yeah, no, it was a huge culture shock for me. 'Cause, I mean, literally, I was running around barefoot, on the edge of a Kalahari and edge of the Okavango Delta. I mean, literally, going out every day fishing and just running wild, right?
And that's it.
To being in a structured system, shoes on
Yeah.
at school in a class of 40 kids.
That British, schoolboy
and then-
system.
yeah.
For those.
No, it was definitely not my most memorable, favorable period of my childhood, let's put it like that. So hence, it didn't take me long to decide to come. To be honest, I loved Africa so much. My childhood was an amazing one. I was always even that time I was saying, well, I'm going back to Africa. I'm just waiting till I get old enough, and then I'm going back to Africa. And but when we came to Guyana, I suddenly realized, well, hang on a second, this is pretty wild here too. There's a lot of very cool stuff here as well, and in many ways even more wild than where we were in Africa.
Okay, how do they compare?
Well, it's just where we were. I mean, it was forest for miles and miles and miles and miles. There was nobody, right?
Yeah.
And there was no tourism, very little, or no tourism effectively in those days. Whereas in Africa, although we were wild, we were going on safari, I mean, you were still seeing people.
Yeah.
The town of Maun wasn't that far away. And of course, there's a lot of wild wilderness and a lot of great wildlife. But I think Guyana has more true wilderness than at least where we were.
And the jungle kind of has that effect because you're in jungle, right? Rainforest.
We were there, yeah.
Just simply for the fact you can't see past
right
into the jungle or savannah or car can see some distance and know where there's a road, there's a house. Yeah, wow.
So I mean, we're blessed again. I mean, we have so much forest, untouched forest still remaining. I mean, there's vast swathes of it. I mean, you can literally, some of the trips I go on, we go for a month and you'll see nobody. I think that's
not even locals.
Not even locals. There's so much wilderness here that you can absolutely do that here.
Wow.
You can go places where there is nobody.
Are there uncontacted tribes?
Not officially in Guyana, not anymore.
What does that mean?
But in the very southern part of Guyana, there's a tribe called the wayyy. They're our remotest tribe, and that is where it borders Suriname and in particular Brazil.
Yeah.
And the forest in there, it's all one forest from here. The forest starts 15 miles from where we are here. And technically, you can, if you were to take a pin and get a map of the Amazon and put a pin in the middle of the heart of the Amazon, technically we could go from here to the heart of the Amazon through forest untouched, but no major breaks in forest, man-made breaks in the forest at least. So this tribe in the very south of Guyana, the wayyy, they're much closer to the actual Amazon than we are, because technically we're not classed as the Amazon here. It's again a shield, but they live very, very remote there. And I have been there on 2 occasions many years ago. And when we were speaking to the local people there, they would say that occasionally they would come across signs of what they would call wild people, which would essentially be small nomadic groups of uncontacted people that are wandering from Brazil. They're nomads, essentially, is what they were describing.
The nomads in the rainforest.
Yeah, but the tribes that move, because not all big tribes would be sedentary. Some of them, traditionally would have moved, from time to time.
Wow.
And so they talk about, meeting what they call wild people.
I mean, not to beat the bush too hard, but did they say much about those signs? Or
not really.
No.
But I mean, they say that they knew that they were there. They could tell that they were there. They could see signs that they were there. They knew that they were, and they would come and go. So for many years, you wouldn't see anything, and then they would be in the area for a while, and then they would disappear again and go.
One can
and
imagine.
even here, communities here, if you talk to the older people, they will talk about what they call wild Indians or wild people, right?
Wow.
But I've never, to be honest, I myself, even though I spent most of my life in the forest here, I've never actually seen anything like that myself. No? But I have no doubt, because it could be possible, because the forests here are so remote and they are connected to the true Amazon, that if people were wandering, they could very easily wander into this area.
That is,
Without, yeah.
that's the thing. Oh, it gives me good kind of goosebumps when I think about the depth of wilderness around here. Now, this is a very subjective question, but me and the boys were kind of framing our expedition, I don't know what you'd call what we're doing here, on a kind of indigenous scale. If 0 is you're a city boy, and 10 is full uncontacted tribe, 7-foot long arrows, where would you rate on that scale of just like modernity, I suppose? Yupukari versus the wayyy versus 10's the uncontacted tribe. Just for context. Because I don't even know.
That's a good question. The people here, they've been in contact with Western culture for a couple of hundred years now, certainly since the 1830s, when that was sort of when the real pioneers sort of came through, and a little bit later when they settled. I would say the last couple of generations, their culture has started to change very rapidly.
Okay.
So sort of my wife's father's generation, to my generation prior to my age, the guys now in their 60s and 70s, they had it very basic. I would say there it would probably have been about 75-80%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Would have been traditional in
'Cause
terms of their language, their farming practices, they would have some Western influence, in particular religion. Everyone has been converted to Christianity here quite some time ago. So their religion would have changed, but their actual day-to-day lives would have been, certainly in the previous generation, pretty much still, hunting, farming, fishing.
Is that like David Thomas? Is he on that edge?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and his generation above as well, right?
Okay.
This generation now, the guys that are in there, or guys and women in their 20s and 30s, there's been a lot of changes. Now, of course, they've retained their language here. Although that's changing as well. Languages always evolve. All languages evolve, right? But there's now a lot of Portuguese in the Makushi. There's English words in the Makushi. And you are finding people in the village that can't speak it.
Yeah, well.
Most of them can understand it, but there are some, especially the younger generation now, there are a few that don't speak it.
Okay, a lot of them switching to Creole?
Yeah, English Creolese, right?
Yeah.
Or Portuguese as well.
Just for that Boa Vista move.
Yeah. And then also some of it is, we have people of different different races and moving into the community. So like myself, my children obviously grow up in the house speaking English predominantly. They understand Makushi. They will speak a little bit of Makushi, but predominantly we speak English at home.
Sure.
And so they struggle to speak it fluently. I'm sure if they put their mind to it, they could. But so the language is slowly changing. But then you see a lot of, the younger generation now, they want the trappings of Western civilizations, right? So a lot of the farming practices are slowly or rapidly changing, actually.
So like moving to cash copy kind of?
Yeah, well, you see, the traditional farming is people look at traditional farming as, it sounds very romantic. You're farming and you're living off what you feed, but it's actually a brutally hard lifestyle.
In what
physically
sense?
very hard work. Because the farming here, you go into the forest, you have to cut down some of the forest. It's slash and burn is the traditional farming here, right? So you have to cut down part of the forest, burn it, then you have to plow by hand plowing, and a lot of the farms are long distances that you have to carry stuff. And
because they always have farms, 10 k's up the river.
Oh, sometimes many more, sometimes 30 miles up the river sometimes. And that's because that's where the best soil is.
Sure.
And places that don't flood, because we have these huge disparities in the dry season between rainy season and dry season, where so in the rainy season, 2/3 of land here floods. So you can't farm it effectively.
Yeah.
Right? Because it goes underwater. So people will choose the high spots where they can farm year round. And they will often farm in the forest where the soil is better and they get better rainfall. And so in particular because of the flooding, it means that they sometimes have to farm many miles from where the village actually is. So farming, is brutally hard. I've done it, I've tried it, for a while. And I can understand why the younger generation say they don't want to necessarily do that for year in, year out. And they look to go and work somewhere else and get a cash income and then, buy food with cash, right? So the farming practices are slowly changing, or as I say, rapidly changing, I would say.
It is amusing because what will be last week's episode, Josie, is kind of he's talking to us about farming. He's definitely in that mindset of, okay, if food runs out, okay, yuca's better than something like buying rice because you might have to cook that. What if you don't have the money for the gas? Okay, yuca you can just, or the farine you can just eat. Or okay, I'm buying cows because they're like a savings bank. It's very interesting to hear about this. He's also decrying the modernization of techniques. Like, oh, now we use nets. It's like cheating. In my head, I'm thinking, what the hell, mate? You're going up every afternoon to catch fish with the net.
Right.
He's like, oh, nah, it's cheating. It's too quick. You should use reel and blah, blah, blah. Is that a popular voice around here or not really?
Yeah, I mean, it's recognized. So, I mean, people are aware that the culture is changing, right? So, I mean, the older people, obviously, older people always, all around the world, always look back and say, well, in my day it was better. And, but I mean, I think most people are aware that there's big shifts ahead. And big shifts have been made already. I mean, when I first came here, in this village here, there were maybe 2 buildings that had zinc sheet roofs. Everything else was thatch and local adobe brick, clay brick. Yeah. And then for a few years it shifted to people started putting on zinc.
It's like
corrugated zinc roofs, metal roofs, right? And then they were burning bricks, so clay bricks. They were doing clay brick, which they would make a kiln and make bricks, which is not a traditional Amerindian technique. It's actually a technique that came from Brazil. Okay. And now, I don't know if you've seen in the village here, now a lot of the buildings are changing now to concrete block. Yes. So they're taking sand and cement and making blocks and plastering it. So it's almost like a Western style house now.
Sure.
But traditional style buildings with thatch like this is getting less and less.
Is that a fashion or is that
It's practicalities.
Okay.
Because the thatch has a lot of advantage. The thatch is, well, in my opinion, looks lovely, right? It is much cooler. But the thatch doesn't last forever. So the thatch, depending on the type of palm that you use and how well it's been done, can last. This type of thatch, if it's done properly, could last maybe 10 years, 10 to 12 years. But then when you replace it, it's a lot of work. You go out in the savannas and cut the palms and transport them in here and redo it. And of course, when the thatch starts to go bad, you get a lot of dust. And insects live in the thatch. And so there's a lot of pros and cons to the thatch. And so for most people in the village, they just rather get the zinc roofs because you nail up a zinc roof, it's fast, it's easy, and it lasts years and years and years, right?
And then I guess in a zoomed out version, which maybe I have the benefit and privilege of seeing where, okay, you have 100 years of that, and yes, you have to replace the thatch 10 times, but it was nicer while you had it, and, it just burnt up. Whereas, okay, maybe the zinc lasts 20 years, 30 years, like a bit longer, but still you're going to have to replace it. And then what are you doing with that?
Yeah, well, I don't think people think that far ahead.
Exactly,
right? People just look at, a lot, the culture here is also, to be honest, a poor man always thinks about tomorrow and next week and not 5 years down the line because they're battling for food for today and tomorrow, right? And so I think for people in these kind of communities that obviously, don't have much cash income. They're thinking short and medium term. And so the zinc makes perfect sense for them. Yeah.
I think I saw that as a definition of a poverty mindset rather than actual poverty itself, of how long can you position a version of you in the future and how far can you kind of think. Fascinating. Okay, yeah, cool.
Because also you see traditionally, culturally, I mean, it's very complex, actually. And this is where you're saying where you have one foot in two worlds, kind of, I can see things from different angles. One of the things here with the people here, Indigenous people here too, is that traditionally, they didn't have to think far into the future. Western culture, when you're in your 20s, a lot of people are already thinking about their retirement plan. Here, people don't think like that, right? Well, it's changing now as the culture is changing, right? But traditionally, they wouldn't have to think about it. The furthest, they would have to think ahead realistically is 9 months.
Yeah. Okay.
And I know you're going to laugh because you're saying, "Oh, well, having children in 9 months' time, that's one part." But actually, what it is, it's down to their farming practices.
Sure.
Cassava traditionally takes 9 months to bear.
Yep.
So when you plant your cassava root, the staple diet, the staple product then for your food, if you plant it now, 9 months from now is when you can start to harvest it.
Okay.
And so that is as far as what they would need to think ahead, because everything else they could procure that day. If they wanted a fish, they could go down to the river and shoot a fish.
Yeah.
If they want to go and eat meat, they could go and do that.
So they don't have to think, okay, I study this for 3 years and then it's going to get me a
Right.
better job, so then I can be
Correct.
affording that level of fish for the next 20.
Correct. So 9 months to a year really and truly was as far forward as what they would really think traditionally. That's before education and Western culture came in. So and some of that still hangs on, right? I mean, traditionally people, it's like the work style. A lot of people, it's like from the coast, from Georgetown or from the west, will look at the way that local people here work. It's very different. The work ethic here is very different from a traditional Western culture. People here work incredibly hard. They're very hard workers, but what they're not good at is working 9 to 5, 5 days a week for 50 weeks of the year.
Yeah.
Because it's not in their culture to do that. Well, here people for thousands of years, basically, they would work very hard in short spurts, and then there would be gaps where they'd have time off and then very hard work.
Do the harvest or plant the farm.
It goes back to farming again, right? So like I was saying, farming is brutally hard work, right? So when you want to go and farm, first you go and you find your spot up the river somewhere, then you go cut it down. And that might take you a week, 2 weeks of very hard work cutting. I mean, you've seen some of these trees in the forest, they're massive, right? And in the old days, they'd be cutting these down with axe and, fire, using fire.
Yeah,
so you'd work very hard with your family and your friends. You cut down the forest, work for 2 weeks doing that. And then you would stop. You'd leave it to dry. So now you have a whole period of time where you can relax. You go and do a little bit of fishing, rock in your hammock, go and have a party. When it's dry now, then you go and burn it. That's a few more days of actually getting it to burn properly and clearing it all up, all the bits that don't burn. You repack them, burn it back again. Then you have to leave it to cool now because the ground is so hot from fires, right? So you leave it to cool for a couple of weeks. And then you go back and now you're plowing and you're farming. You're plowing and you're planting. Again, that's a period of very intense work, hard work for 2-3 weeks. Once it's planted, the farms here are very much self-maintenance.
Yep.
They're not like the farming that we have in Western culture. We have to pick weeds every day. And here you just leave your farm.
Is that just the nature of...
It's the nature of the farming and the type of produce that they're planting. And so you'd probably leave your farm. After you planted it, you'd probably leave it for 3 months, 3-4 months, and then you might go back and do a little bit of weeding. The biggest problem you may have is wild animals destroying your farm, like peccaries or stuff like that.
Yeah,
right?
okay. And in that 3-4 months, you're probably...
They don't have much to do, right? Now
they're helping your mate.
Yeah, you might be helping your mate, but you might be just doing the odd work, doing a little bit of fishing, rocking in your hammock, because everything that you needed to survive was right there on your doorstep, right? So this concept of working non-stop for weeks and months on end wasn't traditionally in their culture. It was work hard, few weeks off, work hard, few weeks off. And you very much see that. I mean, I employ a lot of people. You very much see that still as something that Amerindian people in the villages struggle with, is working for very long periods of time like that.
The kind of guiding, that probably works pretty well, though.
It does. They love part-time work. Right?
Yep.
So you can get people work for a month, then you send them home. They love that because then they go home, they work a little bit on their little farms that they have, and they relax and do things, then come back and work. So I've always found that you try to employ people for a long period of time, it doesn't work.
Sure.
And I think that just goes back to their culture and.
Have you thought much?
But it is changing, right? Slowly, as everything, it's changing.
Slowly
right?
changing, because I get if they're getting drawn to the bright lights of Bella Vista, and
they have to conform.
Yeah, they have to
conform, right? Because that's right. So
right. Have you thought, just while we're here, have you thought ever or read somewhere, because I haven't really thought about this, where the Western thing of that consistent thing comes from?
I don't know.
Don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think.
I mean, people will often ask me, and that that take on that is just my opinion, right?
It makes a lot of sense.
Because people will often, we have a lot of projects that happen here, and I've seen this, and I've had other people come, like we have Cayman House, and we try to employ people like full-time. Okay, you have a full-time job. And then after 2-3 months, they're like, right, we're off. And it's like people, and it's a known thing with the Indigenous people here, is that it's very hard to get them to work real commit long-term. Right?
Yeah.
And I thought about it for a long time. Why is that? And I struggled with that with my own workers. And I started putting pieces together, and I said, you know what, this is why I think it is. And it was why just culturally it makes sense.
I guess it makes sense with that. Everything down to farming, the 9 month to a year kind of time span. If I think, using all the little I know, like I always go back to, I don't know if you love history, but the Romans, for example, versus the Celtics in the European, that was like the first colonialism that I guess white people suffered. And it's an interesting case study I always find, because it's one of the only times where the fight was somewhat fair. They had the same weapons technology, same people, same diseases and whatnot. The interesting thing to note there was that the Romans had this, and off the back of the Greeks and Mesopotamians and all the rest, had this ability and structure to their armies and to their supply routes and all this stuff. And even just their organization, that they weren't squabbling and all this stuff. Maybe that comes from whoever did it first, Egyptians, whatever, aliens, who knows, right? But they basically somehow managed to get themselves a bigger time frame, have this experiment. Well, what if we just do this slow, steady thing over a long generation, so you can build these civilizations, these cities that eventually in the long haul will crush, as we've kind of seen, at least culturally, but in the past, certainly like physically as well, these more native indigenous cultures.
Structure is a good word to it, I think. You're saying, they put in a structure. So yeah, people very much live, on the spur of a moment,
Yeah. Which is so romantic, as you say, romantic is probably the right word, so attractive as well to most of us, I think.
Good afternoon.
How are we?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, now, I look at a culture, and I am concerned that the culture is changing so fast, and I know it's inevitable too. There is a group of thoughts, they should remain the same. Well, that's not going to happen. One is, you're just realistic about it. It's not going to happen. And at the same time too is, I think everyone has the right to, they want nice things, like what they conceive to be nice things anyway, perceived to be nice things. Is, they should have a right to education and the trappings of education. And who wouldn't want to have a motorbike to go to Lethem instead of riding a bicycle 60 miles away to go shopping? And who wouldn't want to have internet and all the trappings of it? So the balance is trying to let people have that, or for people to have that, but at the same time retain and appreciate their own culture, and at least retain some of the skills and the language. And so I think that's the key, is trying to get.
It must be fascinating to live here, because even just visiting, it's always, in England, for instance, Industrial Revolution, like for centuries, the individual has kind of been at the forefront of the material wealth of the world, in a sense. If something gets invented or resources get whatever it is, you can kind of get it as it comes, as it gets invented. Okay, my grandparents had TV, then I have the internet. Even for me, it feels fast. So hang on, the internet, and then like when I was a kid, it was, big box TV, and now it's bloody spaceships and stuff.
Right.
But the term I heard once was cultural whiplash. If you get the last 500 years or whatever it is of technological advancement from the West thrown on you in a generation or two, and just like,
It's caused havoc. It's a very tough time for not just here, Indigenous people around the world, and that's why Indigenous people around the world are struggling in many ways, with issues like alcoholism and just sort of lack of employment, and because they're moving from one culture to another in a very, very short span of time.
Yeah.
And for many cultures, that's traumatic and challenging to deal with, and we see that here too.
Yeah.
There's no exception here.
Definitely seems to be, again, just a visitor, but Australia, far out. It's a huge thing, right? Probably the closest, again, my limited knowledge and ignorance, with America, where the initial genocides were just, for the white person at the time, they worked. You know, I think the current population is 2% of Indigenous Australian. Almost all in the northern half in communities more or less looking like this one. And because Australia is just a wealthy country, I suppose, there is plenty of cash. Like, it's not the traditional ways really at all. So alcoholism and pretty hard drugs is just rampant.
Rampant, yeah.
Where here it's not so much the case. Is it? To what level is
Well,
that?
alcoholism is an issue, for sure. In many communities, I wouldn't say all of them, but many communities it is an issue, and we have our challenges with that here for sure. So I mean, again, it's just sort of giving people the opportunities, you know, education opportunities, keeping them, you know, busy.
Yeah.
And yeah. I mean, again, I don't have the answers to all.
No. It's just interesting because you've got such a.
But we do have those issues, some of those issues as well, for sure.
And I guess my last question, because you mentioned it before, is the Christianity thing. And again, I don't expect you to have answers, but when we rocked up and went to that wedding, strangest wedding I've been to. You know, not in a bad way. It was just strange. I was like, "What's going on here?" You know,
Right.
for context, the tables and.
Well, that was a reception.
Oh, was it?
That was after reception. They'd actually had the church service already.
Sure. Okay.
And the church service would have been held in the middle of the village at one of the churches, and that would have been a very there's a pastor there.
Yeah.
And it would have been a very westernized Christian wedding. Just saying the vows, reading from a Bible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The reception there, it's still there wasn't like, at least how because I'm just not in this culture at all. Wedding reception I always associate with like fun. Like it's just fun, you know, fun, love fun. Like didn't look like it.
It's funny, you know, some weddings here are like that. That wedding, they kind of limited the alcohol to some extent.
Yeah.
The church that they got married in is a Christian Brethren church, which actually promotes a non-drinking culture.
Okay.
And so the pastor was there. So when you came along, I think everyone was on their best behavior because you know, the pastor was there. But later on in the evening, they had a party down there.
Okay, cool.
And there was music and dancing and, you know, some drinking going on and a bit more fun probably.
Okay, nice, cool. We missed out on that. I think we were wrecked that day.
That was sort of a formal lunch part where it is quite formal.
We missed out on the
you missed out on the Brazilian dancing. Yeah.
Damn. Okay. That makes me. It makes part of me at least happy because I was like, oh shit, like this is.
You didn't look particularly happy. Yeah?
No. But like, is there a sense? We're speaking to some in Venezuela actually, but there was a Guyanese guide who takes people up the mountains. I think he was born in Guyana but has lived in Venezuela his whole life. I think by nature of being a guide in that quite mystical place, he was full of the indigenous myths and stories and claimed that most Guyanese would be pretty fluent in them as well. Yet Christianity just seems to, at least here, have quite a chokehold instead of that stuff.
There's a lot of still. So the religion here is Christianity. One of many nominations of Christianity. Originally, when the early explorers came into the Rupununi in particular, it was Anglican and Catholic.
Yeah.
And they were actually very civilized. The Anglicans and the Catholics made an agreement and they said, okay, the South Savannas, which is from Lethem going south, that will be Catholic. And in the North Savannas, in our area here, will be Anglican. And they came to an agreement that they wouldn't encroach upon each other's flocks or territory.
Okay.
And that actually held true way up until sort of the 1980s. And in fact, to this day, the Catholics don't come into the north and the Anglicans don't go into the south. But there are a number of other Christian denominations that started creeping in that didn't have this kind of handshake agreement. So we have, as I mentioned, we have a Christian Brethren, and now we have a Church of Christ, and a number of other Christian denominations. In fact, in Yupukari here we have 3 churches.
Yeah,
in a population of So you have Anglican, Christian Brethren, and Church of Christ. Right?
How does that even? Like, who starts a church in Yupukari?
So the Anglicans started here way back in the 1930s.
Like some missionaries.
Yeah, missionaries would have come in, and the Anglican diocese would have sent up somebody here. And Yupukari was known as Yupukari Mission. They had it was a missionary site. It was one of the first villages that the Anglicans settled in, and they had schools here. And because in those days, in the early days, it was the missionaries that the churches in that started the schools, and so Yupukari was one of the very first.
It's probably servicing the villages.
Yes,
around
and
here as
from
well.
all around it. And bear in mind, in those days, the villages were tiny. In fact, there were very few permanent villages.
Okay.
There were little settlements that would be in a place for a few years and then they would move, right? So these sedentary big villages that you see now is very much a result of Western influence and from the missionaries, because when the missionaries came, they built a church. And the worst thing for them would be having, their flock spread out all through the forest. They don't have a congregation anymore. So they encouraged the local people to form these villages and settle these villages permanently,
How does
so
one?
that A, the children could go to school, and B, of course, then people could attend church. And that's how these big villages predominantly started. Prior to Christianity here, most of the indigenous population were, small families living in an area for a while, then they might move, they might go across. Of course, in those days there was no border. So some of them were moving across to Brazil, and they were all over. So Yupukari was one of the very first villages to really settle as a permanent village. And
Into the church, I guess, coerce, I don't know, like entice that kind of change in your everyday life, being stationary, going to church, because it's free daycare for the kids, or the education.
I don't know how they.
benefits.
So, unlike many countries, I'd never really heard, like in Guyana, that the indigenous people were treated particularly bad. If it was probably more through kind of just sort of neglect kind of thing, just leave them to do their own thing. We didn't have, like what was a mass slaves thing and sort of murdering. I mean, in Brazil, parts of it, Portuguese treated the indigenous people terribly, right? I think under British colonial times it was, much, much, much better. And so I don't think that they were sort of forced into Christianity, but it was encouraged somehow or other. And, these villages started and people switched to Christianity. The last tribe to really switch to Christianity was the wayyy in the very deep south, because they're super remote. And they were converted sort of in the 1950s.
Okay.
Yeah, 40s and 50s.
To be a missionary in the 1930s, I can't even put myself in those shoes.
But here, Makushi, they were, a lot of them were converted way back in the 20s and even before.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Crazy. This question just sprung to my head when you said 20s, but things like in I guess my cultures or our cult, I don't know, half your like World War I or Great Depression or these big things that seem to have affected the whole world, obviously haven't. I imagine an indigenous Makushi here doesn't even register that. Have they got similarly big historical events? Or is it really just every generation more or less runs the same until the last few?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that's how it was. It's just sort of,
The humdrum.
I mean, so much of what goes on in the outside world obviously was just passed by without people even being, particularly aware of, or if they were aware, it didn't really directly affect them. Again, and that still happens to a big extent. But of course, now the world is becoming much more connected. So absolutely, stuff that does happen outside does affect us here in subtle ways. And sometimes people don't even realize it. But obviously, yeah, exactly. When Donald Trump gets elected into power or whatever, or, if some big political thing happens in the United States, to be honest, it affects the whole planet, right? Yeah. Interest rate goes up or fuel prices go up or, the trade wars or whatever, it affects us here, right? But by and large, I mean, even to this day, out in these villages, I mean, a lot of that stuff people don't pay much attention to. So
because the river's going to flood and they can't farm and
they go do their farming, they get their fishing,
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay, that is such a good exploration of all this stuff. Back to you. You're in this island as a teenager in the middle of this river. How does that look? What's next?
So my mom was doing tourism there. Now, bear in mind,
what even is that? Like, what does that mean?
So it basically consisted of a few groups of tourists coming a couple times a year to visit, and we would take them out on the river and show them birds and walk in the forest and show them about the forest and bird watching and that kind of stuff, fishing.
Okay. Were they Georgetown locals?
No, these were foreigners. She specialized, obviously, for foreign tourists. The problem is Guyana is hardly known now. Imagine what it was like in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Nobody knew about Guyana. In fact, most of the tour operators that were dealing with tourism didn't even know about Guyana. Or if they did, didn't realize it. And to be honest, Guyana was not ready for tourism at that time. It was too early.
Yeah.
So my mom's idea of doing tourism in Guyana was a very good one, but she was 25, 30 years ahead of the curve. Now is the time to really start doing tourism because Guyana is becoming much more well known now, and there's much more of a demand for South American, these kind of safari tours or South American ecotourism. So my mom's tourism venture struggled. We did get guests, and we had enough to keep going for a few years, but it wasn't. We certainly weren't making a huge, profit out of it.
Sure.
My day-to-day life basically involved just going fishing, paddling around on the river. I mean, the river was massive there, so big rapids and a maze of channels, and so lots of places to go and explore and fish. And I started doing a bit of guiding when we did
Huckleberry
have
Finn on
guests,
steroids.
something like that.
Yeah.
And so again, from the time I moved there, I didn't go to school. So I mean, I had a lot of freedom again all through my teenage years.
But without the village kids, were you just
There was
on
no
your own?
village kids there.
Yeah, so you just on
We
your
were,
own.
as I say, we were 40 miles upriver from the nearest community.
Yeah, exactly. So were you just doing this all on your
Yeah,
own?
predominantly. I mean, there would be one or two youngsters that were working at a camp. They were probably around my age, a little older probably. So, I mean, I would go out with the men and they would go, when they were going and cut lumber and wood, I'd be going and doing that. And, just getting involved fishing. When they go fishing, I go fishing. And, I used to read a lot. So I did actually read when my mom told me to read the
Nice.
books.
This is
So, I mean, I kept, I was happy as,
yeah,
I was
fair.
very content, exploring, fishing.
Deeply personal question, so feel free to skirt around it as you wish. But considering your dad's over in England this whole time, it doesn't sound like there was necessarily huge amounts of contact.
Not with my dad, no.
No. Did you then, I mean, similarly, dad kind of in and out. Did you grab onto and maybe you never thought about it, but latch onto like other male kind of figures?
Father figures?
Yeah, father figures.
Not one in particular.
Okay.
Not really, no. I mean, and again, I wasn't, my relationship with my dad was good. I mean, we were in contact, but, well, not so much, we weren't in contact out here because there was no contact.
Also,
but I mean,
his
we could
influence wouldn't have
communicate.
been relevant to you. in your
It was
life.
minor. There wasn't much influence from my dad's side at all, no. So, but yeah, and so, I mean, I grew up on this island. Then, actually, funnily enough, a funny part of the story is when I got to be around 18, the few people that I did know of my age group, most of those would have gone to school. And so I was like, I'm 18, all these other kids, they've...
The locals.
Yeah, some of the locals, yeah. Not all of them, but some of them, And again, I had enough exposure to a Western culture to know that most people in the world are going to school, and this kind of age, 18, they're getting their high school certificate, or they're going and do their GCSEs, as they call it in England, and so I thought, I don't have anything of this, So for some strange reason, it suddenly became very important to me that I had to get this.
Okay.
And I can't explain why. It was just an urge. And so I decided that I was going to return to England, and I was going to go and study, and I was going to get some kind of qualifications. And
to prove to the world that I am educated.
so off I went. So I contacted my dad. And in those days, it was all by letter, I mean, I got to write a letter and you get a response sort of 3 months later kind of thing.
Especially
Because
on
no
that bloody
mailman.
island.
You've got to
Oh
go
my
50
God.
miles down the river to the post office, and mail will be stuck there waiting for you, right? And so anyway, off I went to England, and I stayed with my grandmother, who was alive at the time. My dad was staying there. And I went to Torquay Tech for a year.
Okay.
And I sat 5 subjects. And basically what the subjects I sat were, it was a reset class for people, because they looked at me, and when I went to local tech, and they were like, okay, well, give us a little history of your schooling background. And they looked at me with a blank face and an open jaw when I sort of explained to them my situation. And they were saying, well, we don't really have any kind of, we don't quite know what to do with you. So basically what they did is they put me on, when people had failed their GCSE, it's a 1 year, you can resit it as a crash course, 1 year, just go over it briefly, and you sit it again, you can pass, get a chance to pass. So I did that. So I did 5 GCSEs in a year.
Go?
Well, amazingly enough, I passed all 5.
Perfect.
And there you are. So I did work hard at it, I must admit.
And if you'd been reading, and
I
feel like so much of this is just my take, but so much of education high school, probably bachelor's degree, it's still the case. It's really irrelevant what you learn necessarily because you'll learn all you want, like need to learn on the job. But like, it's teaching you how to learn,
Right.
and your brain is definitely ticking away in a very healthy human way, doing all this stuff,
Right.
extracurricular stuff.
So yeah, I did that, and then well, then after I passed, I was like, okay, well that's cool. What am I going to do now? I hadn't thought that far ahead, right? Back to the 9 months thing. I was only thinking about a year ahead, right? And so I toyed with joining the military for a bit in England,
Oh,
and because of course it's
ultimate
very
structure.
well, yeah, but it was also very outdoorsy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I'm good with my hand. I'm a practical, physical person, and so I knew I didn't want an office job or anything like that. And
And were you pretty set, at least in this mind, because you got this qualification? Okay, England's the context where we're living now.
I wasn't really sure, to be honest. I think most youngsters at age, you don't really know what you want to do, right? So I toyed with that for a while, and then I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back to Guyana for a few months, go back fishing, go back wild, while I figure out what I want to do. And so I returned to Guyana. Well, during that period of time, when my mom had her camp in the Mazruni, which says, probably 500 miles in a straight line from here where we are. My mom's very best friend in Guyana was a lady called Diane McTurk, who owns a ranch 12 miles away from here.
Yep.
And called Caranabo Ranch. And Caranabo is actually quite a famous ranch location in Guyana, in the Rupununi in particular. And her parents had been settlers. They settled the ranch in the 1920s.
Wow.
And Diane, at that time, she also did some tourism here. And it was basically the first lodge in the Rupununi, first place to start doing ecotourism as we know it.
Yeah.
But on a very limited scale. Again, in the 1990s.
Sure.
But during my years in the Mazruni with my mom, Diane used to come and visit us in the Mazruni. My mom and we were very good friends. They had very similar interests in terms of wildlife and wild places. And Diane is an amazing character in her own right. Again, another person that had one foot in two worlds because she was originally Scottish, of Scottish descent, educated in England, very good private schools, but born in the Rupununi, raised in the Rupununi. And
what is it about British private schools
they all did all these things. They all sent them because they thought that was the best, right? I mean, it was very good education.
They always have crazy stories.
Yeah. So when we were in the Mazruni, Diane would always talk to me about the Rupununi and invite me to come to the Rupununi. But I always declined because I was so happy in the Mazruni, right? To have plenty of wilderness there. But when I returned around 19, I said, well, now's my chance. Let me go and visit the Rupununi.
Perfect.
So I flew up to Caranabo on a little private plane that was coming in. And I was supposed to come for 3 months. And here I am, 30 years later.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah. Fell in love with the place.
Seal.
Yeah. Fell in love with the place and the people and the lifestyle and so much wilderness here.
So how does it, I mean, for me right now, having only been here and Lethem, what's the difference in these two rivers?
The Mazruni is all forest.
Okay.
Right. It's it's a huge river there. It's big rapids. It's just forest. There was some traffic on the river there because it was a mining area. So you have these dredges in the river mining for gold. Here was just different. Also, here it's much more of an indigenous population, predominantly Amerindian here. We have the actual Amerindian villages there. We didn't have a village, any local villages nearby.
Towns.
Further up, there was a town. Yeah, it was a mining town 40 miles downriver. So here it's amazing. The Rupununi is amazing, especially where we are here, Yupukari, Caranabo, which is, as I said, 12 miles away. So we have this amazing diversity of habitat here. So as you've seen the savannas, which in their own right are very beautiful. These are natural savannas and wetlands. And we have the Rupununi River down here. And then we have these oxbow lakes with the giant Victoria Amazonica lilies. And then 15 miles away, we have big, lush, as big a rainforest as you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And so if you love wild places...
So if you're a mining company, this is not as convenient and good. But
yeah, well, most of the mining in those days was done much further north. Okay. There is mining in the Rupununi, but it's not in very large scale at the moment. Okay. Yeah. And luckily for us, most of these communities now own the land, and mining is sort of frowned upon. And the Kanako Mountains up here, where I spend a lot of time, where I have my wilderness camp I do for tourists.
Okay,
That's all on the edge of a protected area. So, mining isn't really that prevalent in the Rupununi as yet. Hopefully it will
So I'm
stay like
thinking
that.
like the map of the Amazon. I remember when I was thinking about where to go, you immediately think Brazil, and you immediately think like the Manaus or something, the center of it. That's actually for wildlife purposes. Okay, this is what like 30 miles wide or something, and it's a big city. Whereas if you go to Ecuador or Peru or something, it's like you don't associate it necessarily, I think, with the Amazon, but just by the nature of the rivers being smaller and whatnot, it's a lot more intimate. It's a lot
That's
more
right.
accessible.
That's
And this is
right.
probably the equivalent
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. So, we have great wildlife here. The huge diversity of wildlife here,
Yeah, cool.
which was also, very cool. You can go on savannas and see anteaters and giant otters down on the river here, and
Which we saw both of them
Mm,
yesterday.
yeah.
Man.
No, so it's great for wildlife and bird watching, and I just love all of that. And I just love learning about the forest and the animals, and I've always had this desire to learn more about the traditional practices of the indigenous people here. I used to love bow fishing and making bow and arrows and learning all of that, right?
Unreal.
And so for me, I was just following my passion.
Yeah, and
And
I'm going to implant myself in this a bit because I've always been attracted to all this stuff and learning about this stuff. But for whatever reason, like, it's always been to take that back home because my home's, I guess, Australia, but modern civilization. I want to get as wild as I can, but eventually I want to bring that home. But you uniquely, this is it. So it's just this almost more pure process of learning just for the sake of it, not to show to anyone necessarily. Or is there a bit of that in you? Like, I want
for
to do
me,
this.
initially, it was I just wanted to learn it for myself.
Yeah.
Right, and then obviously I started working as a guide, and so then it became also a fact of showing this to other people. So teaching people about the different plants and trees, and showing them different birds, and taking them fishing, and all that kind of stuff. So it's both. It became both.
Yeah.
And for years, I would do these expeditions. Like I started off doing I started working as a guide. Obviously, my whole life I've been involved in guiding. My mom was a guide. I used to go on safari, so I used to see guiding all the time, right? And then, lived in lodges, grew up in lodges, basically. And so, but I never actually made the decision, I wanted to be a guide or do tourism. I was just there enjoying myself, right? But then working at Caranambo, they employed me as a guide.
Cool.
So I lived there for 12 years. And when I say employed, tourism was so low that they couldn't actually afford to employ me. Basically, they were giving me food and board.
Yeah.
And
when someone comes
and
in.
when they were guests, then I would help guide. And the rest of the time, some of the time we would be doing working on the vehicles and building stuff. But it was huge downtime. And the agreement with Caranam was I could borrow their boat and engine, and I would disappear for a week, 2 weeks up in the mountains down here. I'd take maybe somebody like Josie, one of the local guys, and we would just disappear. And we'd go hunt and fish and explore, and I did that for years and years and years. And it was just following my dream and my passion. And then slowly, what started happening is that initially it started off with research crews. The researchers would come, so people like the Smithsonian. They're coming to do a bird survey, let me say, up in the Kanakus, and they would look for a local guide. And so they'd come to me and say, Ashley, we heard that you've been up there and you know the place and you know these areas, and can you help us, run an expedition up there, and whatever logistics involved in that. And so it started off like that. Then I worked for another outfitter that also runs tourism, wilderness trips on the rivers. So, and again, that was just an excuse for me to get out into even more remote places.
Yeah, because they can kind of bankroll it a bit.
Yeah, they were bankrolling it, so I'd work as a guide, but that's how I went up going.
Oh yeah, guys, you actually want to go all the way over here,
right? So and then I was just doing that for years, and then one day I said, you know what? I suddenly realized, what changes when I had my first child, and then suddenly I realized, hang on a second, money does matter. I have to support somebody here now, and so I said, well, what am I going to do now? And by that stage, I'd already spent so long here. I realized going back to England was not going to cut the mustard. So I had to find a way to make a living here.
And that's the interesting thing, because immediately when you're maybe still in that young 20s, you hunt, kind of a young guy in the young 20s. I'm going to incriminate myself here. They're always looking around, thinking about girls and careers and where am I going to find my place in the world. Essentially, I think everyone in their 20s is doing that, and
Not me.
not
You're
you,
not
right?
me.
Because you're not thinking, oh, You're not thinking of this outside, almost salesman thing, Hollywood. I don't know what it's called. Of look at me, I actually have this unique skill set. I could take this to a pub in London and just yarn about, this Rupununi River in the middle of nowhere and just say, everyone would be into it. Nah, I'm just going to be doing
Yeah, no, I was quite content being here. Yeah.
And my question, but you kind of skipped a few steps, so I'm going to bring you back. You're going up the river with Josie-like characters for 2 weeks and the Smithsonian's coming up. The whole missing link here is, okay, where's the feminine energy? You're just boys in the jungle, what's going on. But obviously you have somewhere along the way met a woman. Is there a story there?
Not really. I mean, I had a number of girlfriends here over the years. My first long-term relationship was also from a girl from a village here, not Cindy. And my eldest son in Yupukari, she was from Yupukari, but a lot of the girls from here would go and work at Caranambo.
Okay.
And so I met my first partner there, and I had a son with her, who's now studying in England. He's studying with the BBC doing wildlife camera. Shannon. Yeah, so he's studying in Bristol at the moment to become a wildlife cameraman.
Nice.
And, so he was born in the village here, and then I had a girlfriend in Georgetown. For a number of years.
Were you going to Georgetown?
I was, yeah. So I was spending some time in Georgetown. She also used to work in the Rupununi, and so we would be back and forth.
Was she Guyanese? Or
she is. Her parents were, so she's of Chinese originally.
Oh, okay, right.
But
so
because Guyana had a number of Chinese living here, emigrated here quite some time ago. So her parents were Chinese. She was Chinese.
Chinese have gone everywhere, haven't
they? Yeah.
Oh, right.
But her parents emigrated to Canada in the 70s, and she was born in Canada, but then returned to Guyana.
Just her?
Her and her parents.
Okay, the parents as well, yeah.
And she was an adult at that time already, obviously, but she opted to stay in Guyana as well, and she's still here, actually.
Nice.
And so I'm finally now, again, she's an amazing woman in that, she came from, very well educated in Canada, lived in Georgetown, met me in the Rupununi here. We spent a number of years together. When we separated, went our own ways, she ended up marrying a local guy from one of the villages here, and she has 2 daughters now, and lives in a village not too far from here as well.
Cool.
And so yeah, and then I met Cindy when I was, at Caranambo. In fact, I'd left Caranambo, but she had gone to work at Caranambo, and I met her there, and then, we started a relationship, and I moved back to the village here.
Nice. Yeah.
So yeah. So, yeah.
Epic. Is there a little love story thrown in there?
Not really. It was pretty straightforward. Yeah. No, nothing too nothing too romantic or too spicy.
Yeah. It's always funny because I'm looking around and the Indigenous culture is everywhere. Well, as far as I've seen, except maybe Polynesia, is very reserved. At least to begin with, as I think you said. I think it was you maybe telling me that yesterday. So it's always interesting, at least as a tourist walking in and being like, not to be crude, but like, how are these guys, doing the whole romance thing? Like, what's going on? Because it's so different. And sometimes when I have asked, I lived in the Amazon for a bit, and it did, as they described it, did seem a bit just kind of not transactional is not the right word, but yeah, like the emotions weren't too in. But then you hear all sorts of drama going on and gossip, and Josie was saying people hang themselves over jealousy and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, wow, it's
all. It all happens here. It's just on the surface. People are here. People are a lot more reserved than Europeans initially, especially you just walking into a village. I mean, people will be. They're not standoffish, but they will be reserved.
No, they haven't been.
Yeah, they'll be. Yeah, they'll be. But as they get to know you, within a few days, few weeks, it's just like anywhere else. Believe you me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Do you think that? I think there's.
It's like Dallas down here. You know that? You ever saw that that series,
No,
Alice.
no.
It's like one of these dramas on TV.
Oh, okay,
So,
like a soap
like
opera.
Home and Away or whatever.
Yeah,
Home and
I
Away,
like neighbours and stuff.
yeah, all affairs going on and this one and all drama and things. It's all going on down here
Yeah,
as
you were
well.
saying that yesterday, weren't you? You were like, I don't
Yeah.
have, I'm too busy working.
Oh, right. Gossip, all the gossip. I don't have time for
Around
it.
the village.
But it's, it's all going on.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Kids all over the place and
Yeah.
probably from different. Oh, wow. So, like, wait, what was like? I had a question lined up and I completely forgot thinking about bloody neighbours.
Neighbours, yeah. Home and Away and Neighbours, yeah.
Yeah, well,
That's a memory I took from England. Because, of course, that was a
That's-
hugely popular series
no
in
one in
England.
Australia is watching.
Yeah.
By the way,
It was
It's on
massive.
TV, but no one's
When
watching.
I was there, I mean, everybody was, it was bloody, you had to watch it, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah. So, and I'm not saying Western culture, that whatever that means that we've been referring to. I'm not saying they're necessarily better at dealing with emotions. I'm just used to how people express and deal with emotions. But I do think, at least my generation, this new age is definitely cluing into emotional health, you can maybe call it, just because it's so clearly arising as a problem. And certainly in men, I think the way communicate and express and whatnot is, you could say, improving. Maybe on the flip side of that, it promotes weakness or whatever. Like, who knows, right? But here, it's definitely not the case. Are there other ways that they go about that, or is it just all repressed emotions, or do they just communicate it very differently that I'm not seeing as an outsider?
So mental health, and that whole concept of mental health, not really understood here much, to be honest. I mean, people obviously are aware that people are having mental problems or they're having issues, right? But it's not, there's nowhere here that you could turn to go and get sort of, help if you have mental health issues, right?
Yeah.
Again, it depends. It depends on who you speak to in the village, right? Because like everywhere else, there's, there are different levels of education and exposure amongst the people in the village. So a lot of people in the community here that have lived in Georgetown or lived in Brazil, they'll be much more educated on certain subjects than compared to people who have just been in the village their whole life, that are much more blinkered and have less exposure. But generally speaking, there's very little help for mental health issues. I'd say in Guyana, much less.
Yeah, it seems like that's the utility, the function of Christianity in a sense, is kind of just a one-size-fits-all band-aid on the spirit. Like mental and spiritual health, to be completely honest, and then probably came with the missionaries, Western medicine as well. It's kind of this, okay, we're throwing on, but it's very unidimensional. It's fascinating to kind of witness, I suppose.
I mean, I think a church is something that a lot of people would have traditionally turned to. Their priest, their pastor here.
Yeah.
That is your support mechanism here, to be honest. Is thing. And then, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why there's so many alcohol issues here is that
right.
People are, when they are having issues, relationship issues or mental health issues, turn to alcohol. Not just here, everywhere in the world, but in particular here, because there's so little support and from other mechanisms that alcohol becomes a problem.
Yeah, you just don't think about it. And I guess you kind of lament the fact that whatever indigenous cultures and systems they had would have had the complexities necessary to deal with the human mental health and spiritual health or whatever.
I'm not sure that traditional cultures would have had that much mental health issues. That's the thing.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Because there aren't the stresses that we have in Western culture. You can't pay your mortgage. Oh my God, I'm going to lose my house. You don't have that in a village like this.
Right.
If your house burns down, guess what? You go and you forest down here. You cut the wood, you cut the thatch, you build it away. Within a week, 2 weeks, you'll have another house again, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have, and it was the same thing. You didn't have to worry about your children's education and finding the money to support your children. And so I think in a lot of these cultures, they probably had very little mental health issues that were caused by these external stresses that Western society has, right?
No, that's exactly right. Because I was thinking, but they would have had tailored to them the health structures. But then, hang on, they didn't have those same problems now. So why would they have had the structures? It's almost like with Western problems, you do need Western solutions. But you're getting 2025 Western problems thrown on you. but the only Western solutions you're really getting received is Christianity, which is a few centuries
And is limited in its
is
capacity
limited in its
anyway.
capacity, right? Yeah, it's an interesting
Mm.
predicament to find yourself in.
And that's actually, I'd never thought of that. So, I mean, that's an interesting one that you've just brought up with this discussion here, is that I'd never actually have even thought of sort of, the causes of, mental health issues and the stresses in communities. And then, like you say, traditionally they wouldn't have had that,
Yeah.
And so that's another, facet that they're dealing with, that as an indigenous culture that's changing very rapidly, having to deal with that as well.
Yeah. No, it's that seems like the crossroads, because I'd written down like alcohol and Christianity and this cultural whiplash. Those were kind of the three things I was trying to figure it out, and I guess that triangulates onto you can understand those three through a lens of mental health. I would say. Yeah.
I mean, suicide. You mentioned suicide. Suicide rates in Guyana are very high.
Oh,
I think we have a high, if not the highest, one of the highest suicide rates in the Western Hemisphere.
really?
I read that, and guess which population has the highest?
Amerindian?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and that I know I've read in multiple places,
Wow.
based on proportion of the size of their population.
Okay.
Right, it's very high. I mean, we've had 2 or 3 in this village since I've been here,
Yeah.
that have committed suicide. Which, I mean, only a few hundred people, right? It's pretty high.
Does that have those 2 or 3, for example? Have they been kind of? I can imagine it just being pushed under, like never spoken about, or is it a thing? Like, what's the grieving process? Were they loners, kind of on the edge of the village anyway?
No, I mean, I can't remember all the. I know one of them certainly was a relationship issue. I mean, when it happens, I mean, people don't hide it or anything like that, but it's at the same time, it's not really discussed. Well, what was the root cause of this, and how can we avoid this in future? I mean, it was just sort of accept. Okay, well, it happened, and
So I remember I saw this
But-
video. It was from I think it was a podcast of a guy talking. He had been an American bloke, had been living with the Massa, that nomadic tribe, a very
in
kind
Africa,
of in Kenya and stuff. And I remember seeing them walking around in Tanzania, because they have a weird thing with, I think it was 18-year-old men. Just like they have this, there's one religion, like the Jehovah's Witness or something, do it as well. Maybe it's the Mormons, where they kind of go out for a gap year almost. And it's like they usually go to a tourist hotspot, dressed as Maasai, and make money and sleep with white women is a big part of it. And then they go back to the tribe, and that's kind of, it's a unique thing, I guess. But he was saying one of them had taught themselves to speak very fluent English. I think they got a law degree and all sorts of stuff. And he was like, mate, like, what are you doing? Go to New York, do the thing, make the money, all that stuff. And he's like, no way, are you kidding me? He's like, what do you mean? Like, this and this and this. And he's like, mate, New York, isn't that where people like throw themselves off buildings?
Right.
That's like, hang on. I mean, there's a lot to say about nomadic life and Indigenous versus modern life, but that kind of right there is a pretty potent line,
Right.
an image.
They both of them have their pros and cons.
Mm.
And I'll be honest with you, what I've tried to achieve is I try to have my cake and eat it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to live kind of a semi-indigenous lifestyle, this wild lifestyle, off the grid kind of lifestyle, but at the same time have some of the trappings of a Western culture, right? And I'm trying to balance that. And
Same.
yeah,
I'm at the start. That's why I'm doing this. So
some people are living in the West and they're trying to balance that by going and live out, on a farm in the middle of nowhere, but they still send their kids to thing.
My current plan this year is to.
My thing is I'm living in the middle of nowhere, and I'm trying to have some of the trappings of Western culture.
Get the Starlink going.
Yeah, right, exactly. Be able to watch the UFC on Saturday, kind of thing, and
Yeah, UFC.
Oh yeah, I love a UFC. Yeah,
mate.
I love a UFC.
It's the only sport I can watch.
Yeah. Rugby, I like the rugby too. So we're coming from South African background.
I'm the wrong part of Australia to care about rugby. No, my plan is to set up in Sydney, one of the most, ridiculous kind of crazy city in Australia, but then live on a sailboat. So it's kind of like a, have a cake and a too. So, okay, we talked a lot about Yupukari and Indigenous culture in like this kind of part. Just to compare that, because I know nothing about the rest of Guyana, and I know it's quite different. There's a lot of Afro-Indian culture. You mentioned when we first chatted, a lot of changes currently happening. Can you briefly just touch on the Guyanese situation? Was there a dictator? What was going on?
I mean, Guyana was a British colony. when it gained independence. So the ethnicity of Guyana is predominantly, I hate that word, but is basically predominantly East Indian. So they would have been indentured laborers
So
from
East
India.
Do you mean
For Indians. From India,
Because
correct.
someone was said, like, I was presuming, okay, they're only from Calcutta, like, on the east
Okay.
of India.
No, it's East Indians as in collectively all from India and that
Versus
area.
West India, which is the Caribbean.
Correct. And so they're Indian predominantly. I think it's like close to 50% East Indian is the population in Guyana.
Okay.
Something like that, yeah.
And more or less.
And then the
full
second biggest population is of African descent. So Afro-Guyanese, as we call them.
Is that slave stuff?
So they would have become as slaves, correct. Originally the Africans would have come first as slaves, and then when slavery was abolished,
Indians came in.
the Indians came in as an indentured laborers. It was effectively still slavery, but it was they came under a contract and they worked for a few years and then and then the rest of the population is about 10, 12, 13%, somewhere around that is the local indigenous people, the Amerindians.
Okay. How many white blokes are going around?
I think the European population is around 0.5% or 1%, something like that. Yeah, maybe 1%, something like that.
Right.
Yeah, it's a smattering. It would have been a lot more in the old days, but then after independence, Guyana basically went into a dictatorship and was in a dictatorship for 20 odd
hating the
odd
old
years.
colonizers.
Yeah, so a lot of Guyana, in fact, experienced a huge brain drain. So a lot of the Europeans left, but also a lot of the Indo-Guyanese left, the Indians, a lot of the Afro-Guyanese left. The economy in the country...
Everyone who could did.
Okay. So there was massive brain drain, and sort of Guyana sort of really went downhill.
Right.
And
was that a classic dictator just for whatever reason, communist? I think it was anti-communist, right?
Yeah, I mean, I to be honest, I don't really read too much into all this, but I mean, essentially, I think what happened is that the Indian leader at the time had very left-leaning policies, socialist policies. And of course, in the 1960s, anything left-leaning was
way too close to America to be left-leaning.
Yes, correct. And of course, that was communism and all that. And so, from what I gather, is that basically the superpowers basically helped or basically allowed the Afro Party to get into power. Because basically Guyanese vote along racial lines. The reality is Indians vote for the Indians and the Africans voted for the Africans. That's changing a little bit now as well, but certainly in those days that was along the line. And so, the African Party, which was a party called the PNC, got into power, and basically from there on, once they were in power, they rigged the election year after year after year. And so free and fair elections weren't allowed until like 1992, somewhere around that.
Okay.
But during that period, the country went and again, it was quite a prosperous country under colonial times, and just shortly after independence, has a lot of natural resources, very highly educated. The literacy rates were fantastic in Guyana. So we had a lot of professional people. But again, as things started to get worse, they all immigrated, especially for their children's sake. So we're now in a situation where I think they say, I don't know how true this is, but I know they say that there's more Guyanese or Guyanese descendants and sort of living abroad than there are actually
in the diaspora.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Because Xavier has a girlfriendy thing. She's Guyanese, but has never been to Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
Her parents, I don't think, have ever been.
Right.
Her grandma, I believe, was the story, left and just never came back.
Right.
And never wanted to. There was a bit of a maybe she was pushed out or whatever it was. But
yeah, I mean, it was a tough time for him, for Guyana. And then
the
90s, the free and fair elections came. The PPP, which is basically predominantly Indian party, got back into power, and they were in power for many, many years. The last term, it switched again.
Yeah.
And now the PPP is back in power again, the Indian party.
That story, again, my very limited knowledge of this stuff.
I mean, that's real sort of, just a broad strokes of what it's been about. But I mean, Guyana's on the cusp of huge changes now because of the oil. I mean, Guyana's always had a lot of natural resource in terms of timber mining, to one stage was one of the largest producers of bauxite in the world.
Bauxite.
Bauxite is what they use to make aluminium.
Okay.
It's the ore, it's aluminium. So it
Right.
had huge bauxite mines here. Did a lot of rice, sugar, demerara sugar. But now, of course, oil is the big thing. And, the offshore reserves that they've found and still are finding are absolutely ginormous. And
So it's going to be the last petrostate.
well, I mean, so I mean, Guyana has the fastest growing economy per capita, has done for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of money coming into the country from the oil, and so you're seeing a lot of growth and a lot of activity
And
going on.
we've
So
had
it'd be
kind
interesting
of,
to see what happens in the next few years.
yeah, because we've had some differing perspectives on that one. Like, there was one guy, the building manager of this construction site, he was going off about it. He was like, nah, it's all bullshit because it's not being felt. Yeah, everyone's getting rich, but then the prices are going up just as quick. And for the average person, look at us, we're just as poor as we always have been. For you, it's probably going to be great because you're in a situation that's quite unique and you can leverage and
It's not good for me. I mean,
no?
again, it is a double-edged sword. I think a lot of these countries that suddenly strike rich on oil and these kind of things, they have to battle the inflation because there's a demand for everything now.
Yeah.
So,
I just watched the
there's a lot of money coming in to the government. Government's getting a lot of money, which one hopes that they're pumping it back into infrastructure and health and education and all the good things that they should be. And I think to some extent they absolutely are. Again, I steer clear of politics, to be honest. But we're definitely seeing a lot more infrastructure going up in the community here, and of course it doesn't help. Doesn't hurt that it's an election year, so you'll always see a spike in stuff.
That free
But
Wi-Fi is bloody quick.
Yeah. But I mean, so I mean, in the last few years, definitely, there's been a lot of more infrastructure being built for sure, and there's a lot more going on. Still a long ways to go.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand where you're going. The inflation has been a big problem here, in particular in the last year and a half.
Yeah, it's not a cheap place.
The cost of traditionally it's always been expensive, but now it's getting more so because the cost of food and rents and basic services is skyrocketing. And so a lot of people who are not directly involved in the oil industry are feeling it. So you may be getting new secondary schools built and roads built and all that, but when your salary is still remaining fairly low, but the cost of food has gone up 20% or 30% or whatever it is, you're feeling it. Sure. And so I think this is a challenge that the government's going to have to battle and figure out how they're going to deal with.
Yeah, I'm very from being in Venezuela last week and really getting a strong connection there to then just dipping our toe into Guyana now, and not that I've got any skin in the game, but I've got you leave some part of you and at least you're curious and interested, and I'm going to look forward to kind of tracking this to the best of.
I mean, Guyana has huge potential. I mean, if they use the money right, I mean, you see a small population,
and they've also I read this
vast resources. Yeah. I mean, if the government invests that money wisely, and especially, diversifies, not just relies on oil, but diversifies, takes the oil money and diversifies it into tourism and other products and business, and brings up the education level and all that. There's massive potential for Guyana.
Yeah, I watched this documentary and it showed the top 10 biggest oil reserve countries.
I think Guyana's in there.
Guyana's definitely in there, but you've got some real standouts. You've got Norway, you've got you've got Dubai or UAE, which have done really well with all that, going from fishing villages and desert people to boof. Then you've got Iraq and Venezuela, and oh crap. Okay, so with great power comes great responsibility. The benefit it was saying that Guyana has is, if some country in 50 years finds all this oil, it probably won't be nearly as relevant because hopefully, but likely will be kind of past the oil stage for it to be, changing the country so much. But still right now, very relevant. So Guyana's essentially, they were saying, going to be the last petrostate and has the benefit of having all these case studies before it. Because if you'd found oil 70 years ago, okay, well, it's all going to England, right? Or even 30 years ago, maybe it's all getting blown up in the dictatorship, right? But now it's okay. We can look at Norway. What do they do, right? Look at UAE.
Absolutely. I mean, if I was a government or the president, I'd be living in Norway practically, trying to find out exactly what the key to their success was, right? And um, not necessarily copying everything
Yeah.
because,
It won't be
it's
relevant.
different, right? But, where applicable, I wouldn't be reinventing the wheel. I'd be following, a lot of what they did, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously they've made a success out of it, right? But as somebody once pointed out to me, you look at how many developing countries around the world that have then struck oil, and how many of them have actually made
Ooh.
it,
Well,
really
that's two.
benefited
Real,
from it. It hasn't been a
one really.
disaster. That list is awfully small,
Yeah.
and so that's obviously, that's where I think where a lot of the skepticism comes in. Maybe like from your contractor that you were talking to, is that, well, are we really going to see it
Yeah.
at a grassroots level, and then long term into the future, right?
Time will tell.
So yeah,
Like in 5, 10, 20 years.
yeah.
I have one kind of final question. Because we talked about the Maori Indian population having this real interesting struggle balancing all this change and how do they, or how do others or themselves or the individual, the groups, the communities deal with that. And then even through this is kind of probably more relevant necessarily for you because, you're involved in this economy quite, to at least in relative terms, in a large scale, and this is all going to be relevant for you. Uh, when you talk about raising that first kid and suddenly you have to get into this guiding stuff seriously and then having a family of
Mm,
four now, is it?
mm,
4 kids?
5.
5?
Mm,
Congratulations.
mm.
How do you, not necessarily just in this lens, but in general, you were raised in an extremely random way and then you're now raising kids. How do you go about thinking about what kind of things are you thinking about? What kind of things do other parents around the world think about that you don't have to think about? What things do they think about that you do have to think about?
So that's a good one. One thing my mom gave, I had a huge amount of freedom as a child, as you have imagined, right? One thing my mom did give me was just enough education, an opportunity that had I wanted to become a banker in England, I could have done.
Mm.
Right. So I had that. I always had that in my back pocket. I mean, all required for me was go back to England like I did. I went back, did the GCSEs. Had I wanted to go and become I don't know, pilot or whatever, I had the option there. And obviously, my children are growing up quite different from many of my friends in England, um, and so
But they're also not growing up like you did.
no, they're not. So for me, it's about finding a balance. I want them to have much of a freedom that I have, maybe not as much because mine was a little extreme. But at the same time, ensure that they have a good enough standard of education and exposure and grasp of the world that if they decide, well, they want to stay and live in the village here, they can do that. But if they want to and they want to go and become a pilot or a banker in New York or whatever, that they have that opportunity, that they can still do that. For example, my eldest son right now is studying in the UK to be a cameraman, and that's the ultimate goal for all my children. That's the only goal I ever really set myself, apart from making sure that they're fed and they're healthy and have a roof over their head, is that they have a standard of education that's at least high enough that they will have that opportunity to decide where they want to go and what they want to do. I think that's the same with most parents
For
around the
sure.
world, right?
I guess the challenge there is that within the context of the village, there'll be all sorts of sacrifices that, okay, maybe they have to get, I don't know, they're getting sent to Georgetown for a school where they should, like, well, I want to be in the village with my friends, or like, are there things like that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, for secondary school, I mean, there is no secondary school in the village right now. So, all my children went to secondary school. They had to go to Lethem, and I. So basically, they would stay. I rent a little place in Lethem, and they would stay in Lethem and then go to secondary school, and they'd look after themselves and let them cook for themselves and look. And then during the weekends, we'd go and fetch them and bring them back. And of course, then in holidays, they're here. So I mean, yeah, there are absolutely challenges here, especially in terms of the education.
Yeah.
Making sure that they get a good enough standard that they could go on to something else if they want to. The other huge advantage that they do, I know obviously there are advantages that my children have that other children in the village here don't have. One,
Yeah.
just the exposure from my background and my upbringing. Obviously, that rubs off on them somewhat, and my interaction with foreigners. Obviously, we're working as a guide. I work at Cayman House, so they meet people and they interact, and so that rubs off on them, and they get much more exposure. But also, they have a huge advantage in that they also can have a British passport, and so that gives them a lot more opportunity potentially down the line if they so wanted to. So,
They can still
yeah.
have access to that oil money if it's going on in
Yeah,
Guyana.
well, that's right. So they can come and go, and that's the beautiful. And also, as an indigenous people here, especially in the Rupununi, we have the Brazilian border is not far away, and it's actually very accommodating if you want to go and live in Brazil as a Guyanese, especially if you're indigenous in this area. You can go and you can get your Brazilian paperwork pretty
Really?
easily. You can buy
Like
property over there.
passport.
Yeah. Well, initially you apply for just like residency, and you get your basic
But it's
like an ID
relevant
card.
all over Brazil.
Well, in Roraima down here.
Okay, the state.
Yeah. So there's a small town on the other side of Lethem across the border.
Yeah.
Bonfim,
Spend
yeah.
a night there. Yeah.
So you can just cross over there. It's an open border, and there are many what we call Gaibras that are people from Rupununi that live in Brazil. They're originally Guyanese, but they live in Brazil. They've acquired their Brazilian paperwork, so they have Brazilian passports,
Oh, sweet.
and they get Brazilian benefits and work there.
Tidy up in Rio.
Yeah. So a lot of the people in the villages here have family in Brazil. So, for example, my brother-in-law, he's been living in Brazil for years and years and years. I mean, he's a Brazilian, and he's a Guybraz. He has good Guyanese paperwork as well as Brazilian paperwork. So my children are also eligible for that. So again, that gives them more opportunity. If they want to study in Brazil, work in Brazil, that's another option for them down the line. But that's always been my goal with my children, is just to educate them to that level. And I tell all my children too, I don't mind what you become in life. I have only 3 or 4 requirements. One is that it's legal. And these are, and I
Those
literally,
laws.
whatever you do, it's legal. It's ethical and legal, right? And I mean ethical as well as legal. I lump that all together in one. You enjoy it, and that you do it to the best of your ability. I don't care if you're a pig farmer. If you do it to the best of your ability and you enjoy it, you will be successful, and and that's what it's ultimately about, right? So I don't steer my children, and I know many people do. So you want to become this and do that, and what in God's name are you doing? Those are my 3 requirements, right? Legal, ethical, enjoy it, and do it to the best of your ability, right? So
Love it.
that's my motto for my kids. Yeah.
Awesome. So to round us out, just because there's so many, I mean, I'm going to go back to this quote. And I said, basically all I wanted to ask you about was kind of embedded in this quote in one way or another. We spent 3 months in the bush together on a shoot in a seriously remote area.
Mm-hmm.
What was that? Like, what's 3 months out in the Uncontacted Tribe area? Like,
So that
seeing all sorts
was
of stuff.
that chap there, Colin Stafford Johnson. He's an Irish cameraman, wildlife cameraman, and TV presenter. He's very well known in Ireland.
Okay.
He is the Steve Backshore of Ireland.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mention to an Irish person, they know instantly who he is. There wouldn't be an Irish person who doesn't know who he is. So he came. I'll rewind it a little bit. When I started doing these big expeditions, I started off really. I would do the odd expedition for like a research crew, but where it really started to become consistent was I met this wonderful character from England called Gordon Duncan. And Gordon, he's a painter and decorator from the East End of London. And he's been coming to Guyana every single year for about 40 years.
Whoa.
And when I was growing up in the Mazruni, he was coming to the same area in the late 1980s. And I never actually met him in the Mazruni. Our paths would always cross. He knew of me being there.
See
and
on the boat.
he had heard of him, this crazy English guy coming and spending 2-3 months in the Mazruni area.
Long.
Oh yeah, no. So he would come for like 3 to 4 months every year. And
Just to live
he
wild?
is obsessed with wildlife, rainforests and fishing. And he just absolutely loves it. And he decided to come one year. He chose Guyana because it's English speaking. He doesn't speak any foreign language. Came to the Mazruni, and then from there every year, February the 14th, after Valentine's Day, I think his wife's birthday is on the following day, the 15th of February. So he spends Valentine and his wife's birthday. He leaves, and he will go back normally around April, May, end of April, May.
Brilliant.
And so I had met Gordon actually at Caranambo here. One year he decided to come up to the Rupununi, and that's where I met him as a young man in my early 20s. And of course, when we met and we introduced each other, I said, "You used to go to Mazruni." He said, "You grew up there, right?" I said, "Yeah." And so, anyway, long story short, I started doing these long tours, expeditions for him. Again, I'd already known some of these places, and he's obsessed with seeing wildlife, photographing wildlife. And all these years that he'd been coming, he had never seen a jaguar. And so I said to him, Gordon, I know a particular river where we could go. And we have a very good chance to see jaguar and tapir and big anacondas and all of very cool wildlife. And he said, which is this river that I go up to called the Rewa River.
Oh, yep.
And so I had been there a couple of times and I'd seen some amazing stuff, but hadn't really spent a lot of time there. And so basically, of course, Gordon didn't have 2 cents to rub together. He's a painter and decorator. He comes on a shoestring. He's a bit like you guys, coming backpacking, living. And
living with the Joseph.
yes, correct. Exactly, absolutely. It was like that, right? I mean, there were no lodges when he first came, right? You just, And so the following year, he saved up some money and we went. I stole somebody's boat locally, basically. And I had at that time I had bought an outboard engine.
Slab of beers when you get
Yeah, it was long-term borrow. Borrowing it for a week and return back 3 months later. Anyway, we went up this river, and for every year for about 10 years, I would do an expedition with Gordon, and basically he would just pay for the food, the fuel. Well, I would go. Josie was one of the first ones that would work with me.
Oh, cool.
Josie started working with me in around 2003 on those. But initially, it wasn't a money-making thing. It was an excuse for me to go more remote. I had found basically a partner in crime then who would be able to sponsor it, because going on these long expeditions, even though you're going very basic, there's still some costs involved. You have to pay. We'd go with 2 staff. I hate cooking. Gasoline and oil and food and tarps and and so Gordon would sponsor it. I would be the guide, and then I would hire Josie to do the cooking, and I would have another guide. And because we were often portaging boats over waterfalls, and so you need a little bit. So we go as a group of 4, myself, Gordon, and 2 locals. And so for years we would do this. And on one particular year, he came with a movie camera. And we went up the river, and we on that particular year we had amazing jaguar sightings, and in fact we saw 10 jaguar sightings on one trip, including pairs and behavior. And,
wow! So every week or so you get into it.
Yeah, and we were up there for 6-7 weeks, something like that.
Yeah.
And so anyway, he filmed this, and we were filming. I was filming. He was filming. We filmed the whole expedition. He would take back his footage and make a home movie of it. A little bit like you with your podcast, showing your friends, and he would make a home movie, and he had a friend who would do the editing, and he would have a barbecue, and when he's having barbecue, stick in the DVD and show. And of course, Gordon was a legend. All his friends thought he was absolutely nuts, right? Because he was catching these huge fish and out in the middle of nowhere and running rapids.
Guyana, what?
Guyana, right? So, I mean, and Gordon's become a legend within the Rupununi. I mean, everybody in the Rupununi knows him. He's literally been coming to the Rupununi. He's been coming since, the mid-90s. But he was coming to Guyana long before that.
And he still comes? He
still comes every year.
How old is this bloke?
He's now 78, something like that. Still comes. The only year that he's never come was COVID. And last year, because his dad died. And his dad was 103 or something like that, and his dad died at a
78-year-old guy who I
still
presume
comes.
Still doesn't have plenty of.
No, he doesn't. No, he still works.
What does he do?
He still does maintenance for.
What does he do when he's here? Is it still the same?
No, he goes out. He goes to another village called Surama, and he hangs a hammock there. He doesn't rent room. He just hangs a hammock. He'd get a local guide, like how you have Josie, and they would go out and they would hike and they go on the river and sometimes do expedition. And then he'll also then go and do like a month, 6 weeks expedition on one of the remote rivers here. Loves fishing, does his fishing, still does wildlife photography, camp out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's been doing this for years and years and years. But going back to how I met Colin, so we had this amazing video footage of these jaguars, and he made a video of it. And at one of his barbecues, one of his friends was looking at this, and his friend said to him, Gordon, give me a copy of that video. There's amazing stuff you have there. And this friend apparently worked in the BBC, but he was a cleaner at the BBC. He wasn't a producer or anything.
Because we're not talking the upper echelons of society.
Correct.
This is a barbecue in a painter's backyard.
Correct, in a painter and decorator's backyard. So this guy was the janitor, cleaner at the BBC.
Oh,
did so maintenance work there, kind of thing. And so, but he recognized what he was seeing was very special, the footage that we had taken. So anyway, he got this DVD, and I got this story from the producer 2 years later. So he took this DVD and then he went into the office of one of the producers, a guy called Yupukari, who's a well-known producer in the BBC, and said, "Hugh, you might want to have a look at this." And so gave him the DVD, and Hugh grabbed the DVD. It was just in those days, it was on DVD, and it just had Guyana 2004 on the top, right? And so Hugh sort of, obviously a busy guy, flung it on his desk, forgot about it. 6 months later, decided that his desk was a nightmare, and cleaning up his desk, and sort of picked up his disc. Couldn't even remember what it was or who had given it.
Probably wanted to procrastinate the rest of his packing, like cleaning up.
Yeah, I was going to almost fling it in the bin, right? But anyway, decided to put it in the computer, have a look, and so then he started seeing the footage. It was this home movie of Gordon's trip. And of course, then he started seeing all these Jaguar stuff. At the same time, he was one of the producers that was making the first Planet Earth series, which at the time was the most expensive, biggest wildlife production.
Old Davey At.
Yes,
Yeah.
ever made, right? And it was a massive project. And Planet Earth, the way it was structured is that I think there were 7 series, each focusing on a particular habitat.
Yeah.
And one of them, Q's job, was to make the 1-hour show, Planet Earth series, about rainforests, tropical rainforests. And so he saw the jaguar footage, and they said, that's the iconic species that we want to film for Planet Earth jungles. And at the time, I was living with a girlfriend in Georgetown, actually. Okay. And so out of the blue one day, I got a call. And he basically introduced himself, and I was like, okay, yeah, cool. So, yeah. I'd never worked with film crews at that time before. And anyway, he gave me the whole thing, and he said, you are going to be taking, he didn't ask, he said, you are going to be taking a cameraman up into this location, and you are going to go and film these jaguars, and we're all going to become very famous, and I'm going to get the best jaguar footage ever filmed.
Was he a bit of a... You're making him come across as a bit of like a...
He's a character. Let's put it like that, because I don't know. He may be listening to your podcast one day, so he's a character. Anyway, he was very persuasive.
A suit in this world.
Yeah. And anyway, I mean, to be honest, I was very excited because I worked for a while, BBC Natural History. It was my first big break, really, in terms of guiding, and from there things snowballed a lot with the film crews. And anyway, long story short, the cameraman that he sent out was Colin Stafford Johnson, and so we went. It wasn't actually as long as what he made out. I mean, we went for 7 weeks. I think was the first trip.
Yeah,
and then they came back the following year and filmed another 7 weeks the following year.
Wow, so even more than 3 months.
Yeah, well, 7 weeks, something like that. Yeah. And,
was he also this Colin dude at like the start of his career? Was that his big?
No, he'd already been filming. He's very well known. He's a presenter. He's also made films.
So he's in front of the camera as well.
Yes, and he also does presenting. Yeah, yeah. And he's also helped produce films. And
cool.
He doesn't do filming anymore. In fact, now he brings tours to me.
Wow.
So after those 2 tours, Colin went off. I hadn't heard from him for years, and about 3 years ago, just before COVID, actually, Colin contacted me and he said, "Ashley, I'm thinking of calling it a day on the old camera. It's a very hard life being a wildlife cameraman. You're away from home a lot, and I think he sort of got a bit jaded with it, to be honest, presenting. And he decided that he wanted to lead tours. And of course, in Ireland, he's very well known. So, in particular, India. He'd done most of his work in India filming tigers. He specialized in filming tigers, and but of course, he's been all over the world. So he now runs tours and basically advertises, and people, of course, book to go with him because he's a very well-known guy in Ireland. It's like sort of, booking a tour with Steve Backshaw, going on holiday with Steve Backshaw. He's
Brilliant.
A wealth of knowledge and a character. And so he'd been doing a couple of tours to India and Botswana, and he wanted to do one in South America, and so he contacted me and said, we'd love to do something here. So he brings 2 or 3 groups a year here. We take them up to our camp in the forest up there, and we spend some time at Cayman House, and we do wildlife and learning about the forest and stuff like that.
Nice.
So yeah, so that's why he wrote that very nice quote for me. I actually wrote that a few years ago.
Yeah, I rated it highly when I saw it. I was like, geez, I'm glad I'm getting this guy on the podcast.
Yeah, I'll have to send you. You must give me your email address, your WhatsApp, and I'll send you the YouTube, because I have a YouTube channel, and Colin's on that.
Okay, perfect.
And you can see, he's a character. In fact, he's coming next month.
Oh, nice.
2 weeks from now.
Well, I'm all out of questions, to be honest. I'm sure I could sit here and wait.
Cool.
Thank you
no
so
problem.
much. Yeah.
It was a pleasure.
Glad I take full credit for mishearing the truck driver and
Yupukari.
Yupukari.
Yeah.
But no, it's been a great time, and
Well, I'm glad you've enjoyed Yupukari.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
5 o'clock tomorrow morning.
5 o'clock tomorrow morning.
I shall pick you. You want to come down? You guys want to come
We
down
can
here?
come up here. So
Okay.
5 a.m. here.
Yeah, that would work fine.
Perfect. Oh, what's most convenient?
I'm just thinking I could also go down the hill and.
Don't drive extra. We'll come up here because that's
Call it 5:30.
5:30.
Yeah, 5:30,
Okay, we'll be
6:30. Wait, hang on, let me just work out the time because no point getting there too early. I need to be there 8. Yeah,
For
about
us to be
6.
early, the
6.
better. Yeah. Okay.
6 would be fine.
All right.
Right?
Yeah. We'll be here
Yeah.
5:45.
Yeah. You'll leave like 6:15. It takes about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Hour and 40 minutes to get into Lethem. Because there's no point getting there before 8 because nothing's really open. So,
Yeah, our ride here was pretty funny. Like, just in the back with what that was there. There was a couch that was breaking. There were a bunch of beer slabs. It's like gas bottle and gasoline bloody things. And we were just like, holy crap. We were just getting thrown around like rag dolls in the back of this truck. I thought I was going to slip a disc in 23. It was pretty funny. So more of that, maybe even for sunrise.
Yeah, no, mine. What's that truck over there?
Yeah,
It has seats. It has proper seats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. No, perfect. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Ashley.
All right, good.
Cheers.
Well, you enjoy your afternoon. I shall see you tomorrow.
Likewise.
I have your.
Awesome.